Some truths are buried so deep they take decades to surface. Others explode in a single moment, shattering everything you thought you knew about yourself. My name is Kate, and I'm about to tell you about the day my father's words destroyed my world, and how a simple DNA test changed everything for both of us. Growing up in suburban Chicago, I always sensed something was different about the way my dad looked at me. While other fathers beamed with pride at their daughters, mine seemed to carry a weight I couldn't understand. It was in his eyes, a mixture of love and something darker, something that made him pull away just when I needed him most. For 28 years, I convinced myself I was imagining things, that his distance was just his personality, his way of showing love. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. And on a rainy Tuesday evening in March, during what should have been a simple family dinner, everything I thought I knew about my life came crashing down. This is the story of how 4 words changed everything, and how sometimes the truth we fear most is the key to setting us free. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The rain drummed against the windows of our family home on Maple Street, the same house where I'd grown up, where I'd scraped my knees on the front steps, and where my mother had taught me to ride a bike in the driveway. Now, at 28, I was back for what had become our monthly family dinner, a tradition my mother insisted on maintaining despite the underlying tension that seemed to follow my father and me around like a shadow. I sat at the familiar oak dining table, pushing around the pot roast on my plate while my parents discussed mundane things, the weather, the neighbors, my mother's book club. But I could feel it building, that familiar electricity in the air that appeared whenever Dad and I were in the same room for too long. Kate finished her master's degree last month, my mother, Linda, said proudly, her graying hair catching the light from the chandelier above. Summa cum laude in psychology. Isn't that wonderful, Robert? My father, Robert Henderson, looked up from his plate with those steel-gray eyes I'd inherited, or thought I had. At 55, he was still an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered from his years working construction before he'd moved into project management. His dark hair was now streaked with silver, and the lines around his eyes had deepened over the years. That's great, Katie, he said, using the childhood nickname that somehow always sounded forced coming from his lips. Your mother's very proud. I caught it immediately, the way he'd said your mother instead of we. It was a small thing, but after 28 years of these small things, they'd accumulated into a mountain of doubt. Are you proud, Dad? I asked, setting down my fork. The question hung in the air like smoke. Robert's jaw tightened, a tell I'd learned to recognize over the years. Of course I am. You worked hard. That's not what I asked. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of rain and my mother's nervous clearing of her throat. Linda Henderson had spent 3 decades mediating between her husband and daughter, trying to bridge a gap she'd never fully understood. Kate, honey, why don't you tell us about your new job? Mom interjected, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness. The one at the counseling center? But I was tired of deflection, tired of pretending everything was normal when it clearly wasn't. No, Mom. I want to know why Dad can barely look at me. I want to know why he's been treating me like a stranger my entire life. Robert's hands clenched into fists on the table. Kate, don't. Don't what? Don't ask questions. Don't try to understand why my own father acts like I'm some kind of burden. My voice was rising, years of frustration finally boiling over. I've spent my whole life trying to figure out what I did wrong. Why I could never make you proud. Why you always seemed to be somewhere else when I needed you. You didn't do anything wrong, he said quietly, but there was something in his voice, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Then what is it? Why do you look at me like... I struggled for the words, like I'm a mistake. The change in his expression was immediate and devastating. His face went pale, and something flickered in his eyes. Pain, guilt, and something else I couldn't identify. For a moment, he looked like he might say something, might finally give me the answer I'd been searching for my entire life. Instead, he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I need some air. Robert, please. My mother called after him, but he was already heading for the back door. I followed him onto the covered porch, where the rain created a curtain of privacy around us. The March air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and new growth. Dad stood with his back to me, his shoulders rigid with tension. I'm not going to let you walk away from this conversation, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm 28 years old, and I deserve to know why my own father can't stand to be in the same room as me. He turned around slowly, and I was shocked to see tears in his eyes. Robert Henderson didn't cry. I'd seen him emotional maybe twice in my entire life, and never like this. You want to know the truth, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You really want to know? Something in his tone made my stomach drop, but I nodded. Yes. I look at you and I see. He stopped, running a hand through his hair. I see everything that went wrong. Every lie, every secret, every moment I should have been stronger. What are you talking about? Your mother had an affair, Kate. The words fell between us like stones. 29 years ago, when we were going through a rough patch. She was with someone else. I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. Dad, And 9 months later, you were born. His voice was barely above a whisper now. Beautiful, perfect, with his eyes and his smile, and I've spent every day since wondering if you're even mine. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, could feel the rain-soaked air filling my lungs as I struggled to process what he just told me. 28 years of distance, a feeling like I wasn't enough, suddenly made horrible sense. So you've been punishing me, I said finally, my voice hollow. For something that happened before I was even born. I never meant to. Yes, you did. The anger was building now, white-hot and cleansing. You've been punishing me for existing, for looking like someone else, for being a reminder of Mom's mistake. How could you do that to a child? How could you do that to me? Robert's face crumpled. I tried to love you the same way. I wanted to, but every time I looked at you, you saw a stranger. I finished his sentence, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Well, congratulations, Dad. You got what you wanted. You made sure I always felt like one. I turned to go back inside, but his voice stopped me. Kate, wait! I looked back at him, this man who'd raised me, who taught me to drive and walked me to the school bus on my first day of kindergarten. This man who'd somehow convinced himself that DNA mattered more than 28 years of being my father. I'm sorry, he said, the words breaking on a sob. I'm so sorry. But sorry wasn't enough. Not anymore. I drove home to my apartment in Lincoln Park in a daze, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windshield, and I had to pull over twice because I couldn't see through my tears. My apartment felt different when I walked in. Smaller, somehow, like the walls had moved closer while I was gone. It was a cozy one-bedroom place I'd saved for years to afford, decorated with the kind of careful touches that made it feel like home, plants on the windowsill, books stacked on every available surface, photographs of family and friends covering the refrigerator. But now those family photos felt like lies. The picture of Dad and me at my college graduation, both of us smiling, had he been faking it the entire time? The shot of us at Christmas morning 5 years ago, me holding up a psychology textbook he'd given me, had he been thinking about another man when he looked at me? I sank onto my couch, still in my rain-dampened clothes, and called my best friend Sarah. She answered on the second ring. Kate! You sound terrible. What's wrong? Sarah Chin had been my roommate in college, and had remained my closest friend through graduate school and into our adult lives. She was practical, logical, and had never hesitated to tell me the truth, even when it hurt. My dad just told me I might not be his daughter, I said without preamble. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. What do you mean, might not be? I told her everything, the conversation on the porch, the revelation about my mother's affair, the 28 years of distance that suddenly made sense. Sarah listened without interrupting, the way she always did when I needed to talk through something difficult. Oh, Kate, she said when I finished. I'm so sorry. That's a lot to process. I don't know what to do, I admitted. Part of me wants to pretend this conversation never happened, but I can't unknow what I know now. Have you talked to your mom about this? Not yet. I don't even know where to start. I pulled a throw pillow into my lap, hugging it like a shield. How do you ask your mother if she cheated on your father? How do you ask if the man who raised you isn't your biological father? Maybe you start with a DNA test, Sarah said gently. The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. A DNA test? Kate, you're a psychologist. You know that uncertainty is often worse than the truth. If you want to know for sure, there are ways to find out. I was quiet for a long moment, considering. The thought of actually taking a test felt both terrifying and liberating. For 28 years, I'd lived with the weight of my father's distance, blaming myself for not being good enough, smart enough, lovable enough to earn his unconditional love. But what if it wasn't about me at all? What if it was about biology, about genetics, about a truth none of us had been brave enough to face? What if the test confirms what he thinks? I asked. What if I'm not his daughter? Then you'll know. And knowing means you can decide what to do next. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. You can't live your whole life in limbo, Kate. You deserve to know who you are. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my apartment, listening to the rain against the windows and thinking about identity. As a psychologist, I'd studied the importance of self-concept, the way our understanding of ourselves shapes every aspect of our lives. But what happens when the foundation of that understanding is called into question? I thought about my childhood, searching for clues I might have missed. Had I really inherited my father's gray eyes, or had I simply seen what I wanted to see? My dark hair was different from both my parents. Mom's was lighter, Dad's was darker. My height, my build, the shape of my face. Suddenly everything felt uncertain. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching DNA testing options. The technology had advanced dramatically in recent years, and there were several companies that offered paternity testing with results available in just a few weeks. I chose a company that allowed for discrete testing. I could collect samples at home and mail them in without involving anyone else. The kit arrived 3 days later in a plain brown envelope. Standing in my kitchen, holding the testing kit, I felt like I was holding a bomb. Once I opened it, once I followed through with the test, there would be no going back. The truth, whatever it was, would be out there. But Sarah was right. I couldn't live in uncertainty anymore. I deserved to know who I was. The process was surprisingly simple. A cheek swab for me, instructions for collecting a sample from my father. The hardest part would be getting Dad to agree to the test. I called him that evening. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice guarded. Kate! Dad, I need to ask you something. I took a deep breath. I want to take a DNA test. To know for sure. The silence stretched between us. I could hear the TV in the background, the familiar sounds of a baseball game. Kate, I don't think that's... I need to know, I interrupted. For 28 years, I felt like something was wrong, like I didn't belong. Now I know why. But I need to know the truth, Dad. All of it. Another long pause. What if the test shows what I think it shows? Then we'll deal with it. But at least we'll know. And if it shows I was wrong? If you are my daughter? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the question. Then we'll deal with that too. When he finally agreed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, hope. Not hope for a specific outcome, but hope for an end to the uncertainty that had defined my relationship with my father for as long as I could remember. The next day, I drove to my childhood home to collect his sample. Mom was at work, and Dad and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table where we'd had so many awkward conversations over the years. Are you sure about this? He asked as I opened the testing kit. I've never been more sure of anything. He nodded and allowed me to swab his cheek. The whole process took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. When I sealed the samples in their respective containers, I felt like I was sealing our fate. How long until we know? He asked. 2 to 3 weeks. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us staring at the sealed envelope that contained our samples. Kate, he said finally, I want you to know that no matter what this test shows, Don't, I said quietly. Let's wait for the results. Then we'll talk. As I drove home with the samples, I felt like I was carrying the weight of our entire relationship in that envelope. In 2 to 3 weeks, I would know who I really was. And more importantly, I would know if the man who raised me had spent 28 years resenting me for something I couldn't control. The waiting was about to begin. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of routine and restless nights. I threw myself into my work at the counseling center, helping other people navigate their family traumas while trying to ignore my own. My colleagues noticed the change in me, the way I'd stare off into space during meetings, the dark circles under my eyes from too little sleep. You look like hell, Sarah said when she came over for dinner on a Thursday evening. She brought Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine, settling onto my couch with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd been my friend for a decade. "I feel like hell," I admitted, stabbing at my lo mein with chopsticks. "I keep thinking about the test, about what the results might mean. Have you talked to your mom about any of this?" I shook my head. "I can't. Not yet. She doesn't even know I took the test." "Kate, she's part of this too. If there was an affair, she's the only one who knows the whole truth." I knew Sarah was right, but the thought of confronting my mother about something that had happened nearly 3 decades ago felt overwhelming. Linda Henderson was 62 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who spent her days volunteering at the local library and tending to her garden. She'd always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who smoothed over the rough edges between Dad and me. How do you ask your mother if she cheated on your father? How do you ask if the foundation of your family is built on a lie? "I'll talk to her after I get the results," I said finally. "There's no point in stirring everything up if the test shows I'm Dad's daughter." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The damage was already done. Dad had lived with his doubts for 28 years, and I'd lived with the consequences of those doubts. Even if the test proved I was his biological daughter, could we ever get back what we'd lost? The results arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after I'd sent in the samples. I was getting ready for work when I heard the mail drop through the slot in my front door. Among the bills and advertisements was a standard white envelope with the testing company's logo in the corner. I sat on my couch, still in my pajamas, and stared at the envelope for a full 10 minutes. Inside was the answer to the question that had been haunting my family for nearly 3 decades. Inside was the truth about who I was. My hands were shaking as I tore open the envelope and pulled out the folded document. The language was clinical, full of scientific terms and probability percentages. But the conclusion was clear. Based on the DNA analysis, the alleged father is excluded as the biological father of the child. The probability of paternity is 0%. I read the sentence 3 times before the words fully sank in. Robert Henderson was not my biological father. The man who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my homework, who had walked me down the aisle at my college graduation, he was not my father. The grief hit me like a physical blow. I doubled over on my couch, clutching the test results to my chest, and sobbed. For the father I'd never really had, for the relationship that had been doomed from the start, for the 28 years of distance that suddenly made perfect, horrible sense. But underneath the grief was something else, a strange sort of relief. The doubt that had plagued me my entire life, the feeling that I was somehow not enough, finally had an explanation. It wasn't about me. It had never been about me. I called in sick to work and spent the day processing the news. I wanted to call Sarah, to call my mother, to do something with the information that was burning a hole in my chest. But first, I needed to tell Dad. He answered his phone on the second ring. "Kate, you sound upset." "The results came in," I said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear him breathing, could picture him sitting in his home office, probably staring at the family photos on his desk, photos that now felt like artifacts from a different life. "And?" he asked, though I could tell from his voice that he already knew. "You were right. You're not my biological father." Another long pause. "How do you feel about that?" The question caught me off guard. I'd expected anger, or vindication, or maybe even relief from him. I hadn't expected concern for my feelings. "I don't know," I admitted. Sad, confused, a little angry, but also relieved. Relieved. I finally understand why things were always so difficult between us. It wasn't because I wasn't good enough, or smart enough, or lovable enough. It was because you were looking at me and seeing a stranger. "Kate, I need to see you," I interrupted. "We need to talk about this face to face. Are you sure? Maybe we should wait, let this settle for a while." "No more waiting, Dad. I've waited 28 years for the truth. Now I have it, and we need to figure out what to do with it." We agreed to meet at the small park near my childhood home, neutral ground where we could talk without the weight of family history pressing down on us. I arrived first and sat on a bench overlooking the pond where I'd fed ducks as a child. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting everything in golden light. Dad arrived 10 minutes later, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He sat down beside me, leaving careful space between us, and for a moment we just watched the ducks gliding across the water. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I'm sorry for all of it." "I know you are." I pulled the test results from my purse and handed them to him. "But sorry doesn't change what happened. Sorry doesn't give me back the childhood I should have had." He took the papers with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the scientific language that confirmed what he'd suspected for nearly 3 decades. When he finished reading, he folded the papers carefully and handed them back to me. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know. I guess we figure out how to move forward. Are you going to try to find him? Your biological father?" The question hung in the air between us. I'd been so focused on getting the test results that I hadn't thought much about what came next. Somewhere out there was a man who was my actual father, a man who probably had no idea I existed. "Maybe," I said. "Do you know who he was?" Robert shook his head. "Your mother never told me. She said it was better if I didn't know." "Then I guess I need to talk to Mom." He nodded, understanding. "She's going to be devastated. She spent 30 years trying to hold our family together. She held it together by keeping secrets. Maybe it's time for the truth." We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the magnitude of what had been revealed. Finally, Dad turned to me, his gray eyes that I now knew I hadn't inherited, filled with tears. "I want you to know that I love you," he said. "I've always loved you. I couldn't get past the doubt. I couldn't stop wondering if you were mine." "But I was yours," I said, surprising myself with the fierceness in my voice. "For 28 years, I was your daughter. You raised me, you protected me, you taught me right from wrong. DNA doesn't change that. Then why does it feel like it changes everything?" I looked out at the pond, at the ducks swimming in lazy circles, and thought about the question. Because now we can be honest. For the first time in my life, I understand why things were the way they were. And maybe understanding is the first step toward healing. When I got home that evening, I found a voicemail from my mother. She talked to Dad, and she wanted to see me. Her voice was shaky, filled with the kind of fear that comes from knowing your secrets are about to be exposed. Tomorrow, I would learn the rest of the truth. Tomorrow, I would find out about the affair that had created me, about the man who was my biological father, about the choices my mother had made that had shaped my entire life. But tonight, I sat in my apartment with the test results in my hand, and for the first time in 28 years, I felt like I truly knew who I was. My mother's hands shook as she poured tea into her favorite china cups, the delicate blue and white set that had been her mother's, save for special occasions and difficult conversations. We sat in her living room, the same room where I'd done homework as a child and where she taught me to knit during long winter evenings. But today, everything felt different. The familiar space seemed smaller, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. "Your father told me about the test," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. At 62, Linda Henderson still carried herself with the quiet dignity of a teacher she'd been for 35 years. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore the kind of sensible cardigan that had been her uniform for decades. "Then you know why I'm here," I said, accepting the cup of tea with hands that were steadier than I'd expected. She sat down across from me, her own cup untouched. "I've been dreading this conversation for 28 years. Then maybe it's time we had it." The silence stretched between us, filled with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the same clock that had marked the hours of my childhood, that had chimed through homework sessions and birthday parties and Christmas mornings. "I need to know about the affair," I said finally. "I need to know about my biological father." My mother's composure cracked. Tears filled her eyes, and she pressed a hand to her mouth as if she could hold back the words that had been trapped inside her for so long. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. "Your father and we were going through such a difficult time. He was working 18-hour days, trying to get his construction business off the ground. We barely spoke, barely saw each other. I felt so alone. I leaned forward, my heart breaking for the young woman my mother had been, 28 years old, the same age I was now, struggling in a marriage that was falling apart. Who was he? I asked gently. His name was Michael Torres. He was a teacher at the school where I worked, the high school English department. He was everything your father wasn't at that time. Present, attentive. He listened when I talked." She paused, lost in a memory that was nearly 3 decades old. It only lasted 3 months. I ended it when I realized what I was doing, what I was risking. I loved your father, Kate. I knew we were just going through a rough patch, and I didn't want to lose him over a mistake. But you got pregnant. I didn't know at first. When I found out, I was terrified. I'd been with both of them during that time period, and I honestly didn't know. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. You didn't know who the father was? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I prayed it was Robert's. I prayed every night for 9 months that you would be his daughter. When you were born, you looked so much like me that I convinced myself my prayers had been answered. But Dad had doubts. From the beginning. He never said anything directly, but I could see it in his eyes. The way he looked at you, the way he held himself back. I kept hoping he would let it go, that he would love you so much it wouldn't matter. But it did matter. It mattered to him, and it mattered to me. My mother set down her teacup with shaking hands. I'm so sorry, Kate. I'm sorry for the secret, for the lies, for the way it affected your relationship with your father. I was young and scared, and I made choices that hurt everyone I loved. I studied her face, seeing the weight of 3 decades of guilt written in every line. What happened to Michael Torres? He left town at the end of that school year. Got a job in California, I think. I never told him about you. Never told him he might be your father. I thought it was better that way. Better for who? For everyone. For your father. For Michael, for you. I thought if I could just keep the secret, we could all move on. But we didn't move on, did we? I set down my own cup, the tea growing cold. We spent 28 years tiptoeing around the secret. Dad spent 28 years looking at me and wondering if I was his daughter. I spent 28 years feeling like I wasn't good enough for him. Kate, please. I'm not angry at you, Mom. The words surprised me as much as they seemed to surprise her. I'm angry at the situation, at the choices that were made, at the time we lost. But I'm not angry at you for being human. She looked at me with such hope and relief that I felt my heart break all over again. What do you want to do about Michael? She asked. I'd been thinking about this question since I'd gotten the test results. Part of me was curious about the man who was my biological father, who had unknowingly contributed half of my genetic makeup. But another part of me was terrified of opening that door. I don't know. Do you think he's still alive? Still in California? I honestly don't know. It's been so long, and we didn't keep in touch after he left. What was he like? My mother's expression softened. He was kind. Funny. He loved literature and music, and he had this way of making everyone around him feel important. He was divorced, no children. He wanted kids, but it never happened with his ex-wife. Do I look like him? She studied my face, and I saw recognition dawn in her eyes. Your eyes. They're his eyes. And your smile, you have his smile. I don't know how I convinced myself otherwise for so long. We sat in silence, both of us processing the weight of what had been revealed. Finally, my mother reached across the space between us and took my hand. What happens now? She asked. I don't know, I admitted. I need time to think about all of this. About whether I want to find him, about how to move forward with Dad. Your father is devastated. He called me after you met with him yesterday. He said he's been thinking about all the moments he pulled away from you, all the times he should have been there and wasn't. He can't change the past. No, but maybe he can change the future. Maybe you both can. I squeezed her hand. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. She nodded. If you had to do it all over again, would you tell the truth from the beginning? She was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. I think I would tell Robert about the affair. I think I would be honest about the possibility that you weren't his biological daughter. But I would also tell him that it didn't matter, that we were going to love you and raise you together regardless of genetics. And if he couldn't do that, then I would have made different choices. I would have protected you from feeling unwanted, even if it meant protecting you from him. The strength in her voice surprised me. For so long, I'd seen my mother as the peacemaker, the one who smoothed things over and avoided conflict. But there was steel underneath that gentle exterior. Mom, I need you to know that I don't blame you for loving someone else when you were unhappy. I don't blame you for being human. But I do blame you for letting me grow up feeling like I was the problem. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know. I'm so sorry, Kate. If I could take back the years of uncertainty, of watching you struggle to understand why your father seemed so distant, I would. But I can't. All I can do is try to make things right moving forward. How do we do that? We start with honesty. Complete honesty. No more secrets, no more pretending everything is fine when it isn't. I thought about that as I drove home later that evening. Honesty was a luxury we'd never been able to afford in our family. We'd built our entire relationship on carefully constructed lies and deliberate omissions. But maybe it wasn't too late to change that. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and began searching for Michael Torres. It was a common name, and without more information, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. But I had to try. I found dozens of Michael Torres in California, but none of them seemed to match the description my mother had given me. I tried searching for high school English teachers, for men who would be in their late 50s or early 60s now, but came up empty. Finally, I found a website that specialized in helping people find lost connections, former classmates, old friends, biological parents. I hesitated for a long moment before creating an account and submitting a search request. Michael Torres, high school English teacher, would have been in his late 20s or early 30s in 1996. Moved to California from the Chicago area. It was a long shot, but it was a start. As I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, I thought about the strange turns my life had taken in the past few weeks. A month ago, I'd been a successful therapist with a complicated but manageable relationship with her father. Now I was a woman searching for her biological father while trying to repair the damage done by 28 years of secrets. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was moving toward something instead of away from it. I was moving toward the truth, whatever that might mean. 2 weeks after I'd submitted the search request, I received a call from the investigative service. They'd found a Michael Torres who matched the description, a former high school English teacher who had moved to Sacramento, California, in 1996. He was now retired and living in a small town outside the city. We found a current address and phone number, the investigator told me. But before we make contact, we need to know how you want to proceed. Do you want us to reach out to him, or would you prefer to make the initial contact yourself? I sat in my office at the counseling center, staring out the window at the Chicago skyline, and tried to imagine what I would say to a man I'd never met who might be my biological father. Hello, you don't know me, but I think you might be my father. Oh, and by the way, you had an affair with my mother 28 years ago. I'll call him myself, I said finally. That evening, I sat on my couch with the phone number written on a piece of paper, my hands shaking as I dialed. The phone rang 4 times before a man answered. Hello! His voice was warm and slightly raspy, with the kind of cultured cadence that suggested years of teaching. I felt something catch in my throat. Is this Michael Torres? I asked. Yes, it is. Who's calling? My name is Kate Henderson. I'm calling from Chicago, and I believe you knew my mother, Linda Henderson, back when she was Linda Walsh. The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if the call had been dropped. Then I heard him take a sharp breath. Linda, he said softly. Oh my God. Is she all right? She's fine. But Mr. Torres, I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to say it. Please call me Michael. And just say it, whatever it is. I closed my eyes and took the leap. I have reason to believe you might be my biological father. Another long silence. I could hear him breathing, could picture him sitting in whatever room he was in, trying to process what I just told him. How old are you? He asked finally. 28. I was born in December 1996. December, he repeated, and I could hear something change in his voice. Linda was pregnant when I left Chicago. I always wondered. You knew. I suspected. She told me she was going to work things out with her husband, that we couldn't see each other anymore. A few weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that she was expecting. I did the math, but I never knew for sure. My heart was pounding, so hard I was sure he could hear it through the phone. Why didn't you try to find out? Because she asked me not to. She said she was going to tell her husband the baby was his, and she begged me not to interfere. She said it was the only way she could save her marriage. I felt a flash of anger toward my mother. She'd made the choice to deny Michael the chance to know about me, just as she denied me the chance to know about him. Did you want children? I asked. More than anything, he said, his voice thick with emotion. My ex-wife and I tried for years, but it never happened. When we divorced, I thought my chance had passed. I'm sorry. I'm sorry you didn't know about me. Kate, he said, and hearing my name in his voice felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. Would you be willing to meet? I live in California now, but I could come to Chicago, or you could come here. I'd like to see you, if you're comfortable with that. I'd like that too. We made plans for him to fly to Chicago the following weekend. As we talked logistics, I found myself studying his speech patterns, looking for similarities to my own. He was articulate and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that reminded me of myself. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my apartment and tried to process what had just happened. In the span of a phone call, I'd gone from being a woman searching for her biological father to being a daughter preparing to meet the man who might be her dad. The next few days passed in a blur of nervous energy. I told Sarah about the call, and she insisted on being there when Michael arrived, for moral support and also because I'm dying to meet him. I also called my mother to tell her about the conversation. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. How did he sound? She asked finally. Like a nice man. Like someone I'd like to know better. He was, she said softly. He was a good person, Kate. If he is your father, you could do a lot worse. Are you okay with this? With me meeting him? I'm terrified, she admitted. But not because I don't want you to know him. I'm terrified because I'm afraid you'll realize how much I kept from you, how many choices I made that weren't mine to make. Mom, we've been through this. I'm not angry at you for being human. But are you angry at me for keeping you from him? For keeping him from you? I considered the question. I'm sad about the time we lost. But I understand why you made the choices you did. You were trying to protect your family. I was trying to protect myself, she corrected. I was scared and selfish, and I convinced myself I was doing what was best for everyone. The honesty in her voice was refreshing. For so long, my mother had hidden behind justifications and explanations. But this raw admission of her own fear and selfishness felt like the beginning of real healing. Michael's flight arrived on a Saturday morning. I'd offered to pick him up at the airport, but he'd insisted on taking a cab to my apartment, saying he didn't want me to feel trapped if the meeting didn't go well. I spent the morning cleaning my already clean apartment and changing clothes 3 times. Sarah arrived an hour before Michael was due to appear, bearing coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery. You look terrified, she observed, settling onto my couch. I am terrified. What if we don't like each other? What if there's no connection? What if this just makes everything more complicated? Then you'll deal with it. You're good at dealing with complicated, Kate. It's literally your job. At exactly 11 o'clock, my buzzer rang. I stood frozen in my living room, suddenly unable to move. I'll get it, Sarah said, pressing the button to let him into the building. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on my door. I opened it to find a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and familiar gray-green eyes. He was tall and lean, dressed in jeans and a button-down shirt, holding a small bouquet of flowers. Kate, he said, and his voice was the same warm tone I'd heard on the phone. Hi, Michael. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. I could see him studying my face, looking for resemblances, just as I was studying his. The eyes were definitely the same, and there was something about the shape of his mouth that reminded me of my own reflection. These are for you, he said, offering the flowers. I wasn't sure what to bring to a meeting like this. They're beautiful. Come in, please. I introduced him to Sarah, who tactfully excused herself after a few minutes of polite conversation, claiming she had errands to run. Michael and I sat across from each other in my living room, both of us clearly nervous. I have to ask, I said finally, have you taken a paternity test? Because I don't want either of us to get our hopes up if... I took one yesterday, he said, pulling a sealed envelope from his jacket pocket. Same company you used, based on what you told me on the phone. The results are in here. My heart stopped. You haven't looked? I wanted us to look together. If that's okay with you. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He handed me the envelope, and I opened it with shaking hands. The language was familiar now, the same clinical terms I'd seen on my own test results. But the conclusion was different. Based on the DNA analysis, the alleged father is not excluded as the biological father of the child. The probability of paternity is 99.7%. "Oh my God," I whispered. Michael leaned forward. "What does it say?" I handed him the paper, watching as his eyes scanned the results. When he looked up at me, there were tears in his eyes. "You're my daughter," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "I'm your daughter." We both started crying then, sitting in my living room, two strangers who had just discovered they were family. It was overwhelming and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there," he said. "I'm so sorry I missed your childhood, your graduation, all the important moments." "You didn't know," I said. "You couldn't have been there if you didn't know I existed. But I should have tried harder to find out. I should have insisted on knowing the truth. We both know Mom wasn't going to tell you. She was protecting the family she had." We spent the rest of the day talking. He told me about his life in California, his work as a teacher, his love of literature and music. I told him about my career in psychology, my relationship with the man I thought was my father, the years of feeling like I didn't quite belong. "You got your love of books from me," he said when I showed him my overflowing bookshelves. "And probably your analytical mind. I always told my students that literature was just psychology dressed up in pretty language." As the afternoon wore on, I found myself relaxing in his presence. There was an ease between us that I'd never experienced with Robert, a natural connection that felt both foreign and familiar. "What happens now?" I asked as evening approached. "Whatever you want to happen," he said. "I don't want to push myself into your life or complicate things with your family. But if you're willing, I'd like to get to know you. I'd like to be part of your life, if there's room for me." "There's room," I said. "There's definitely room." After he left to go to his hotel, promising to have dinner with me the next day before his flight back to California, I sat in my apartment and tried to process everything that had happened. I had a biological father. I had a man who wanted to know me, who was interested in my life, who looked at me without the weight of doubt and resentment. It was everything I'd always wanted, and it felt like a miracle. But it also raised new questions about the man who had raised me, about the relationship we might still be able to salvage. Robert Henderson might not be my biological father, but he was still the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had driven me to school, who had been there for 28 years, even when he'd struggled to show his love. The truth had set us free from the uncertainty that had plagued our family for decades. But now we had to figure out what to do with that freedom. 3 months after meeting Michael, I found myself sitting across from Robert Henderson in his favorite diner, the same place he'd taken me for pancakes on Saturday mornings when I was a child. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, creating a backdrop of normalcy for what felt like the most important conversation of my life. "You look happy," he said, studying my face across the worn Formica table. "Different. Lighter, somehow." I considered his observation. He was right. I did feel lighter. The weight I'd carried for 28 years, the constant question of why I wasn't enough for my father, had finally been lifted. "I am happy. For the first time in my life, I understand who I am." "And you have a relationship with him now?" "With Michael." There was no bitterness in his voice, which surprised me. Over the past few months, Robert had asked careful questions about my relationship with my biological father, listening with what seemed like genuine interest as I told him about our phone calls, our plans for me to visit California, the easy connection we discovered. "I do. We talk every week, and I'm flying out to see him next month." I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug, drawing warmth from the ceramic. He's everything I always hoped a father could be. Present, interested, proud of who I am. Robert nodded slowly. "I'm glad. You deserve that." "But Dad," I said, using the title that still felt natural despite everything we'd learned, "I want you to know that having Michael in my life doesn't erase the 28 years you were in it. Even though I wasn't the father you deserved." I looked at this man who had raised me, who had struggled with doubts and insecurities that I now understood weren't really about me at all. The past few months had given me perspective on our relationship, helped me see it through the lens of compassion rather than hurt. "You were the father you were capable of being under impossible circumstances," I said. "I'm not going to pretend those years weren't difficult, that I didn't spend most of my childhood feeling like I wasn't good enough for you. But I also understand now that you were fighting a battle I didn't even know existed. That doesn't excuse how I treated you. No, it doesn't. But it explains it. And explanation isn't the same as forgiveness, but it's a start. Robert's eyes filled with tears, something that had become more common since the truth had come out. It was as if learning that his doubts had been justified had somehow freed him to feel the grief he'd been holding back for decades. I keep thinking about all the moments I missed because I was so caught up in wondering if you were mine, he said. Your first steps, your school plays, your graduation. I was there physically, but I wasn't really present. I was always holding part of myself back. I know. I felt it. How do we fix that? How do we move forward? I've been thinking about this question for months, working through it in therapy sessions with my own counselor and in long conversations with Sarah and Michael. The answer wasn't simple, but it was clear. We start over, I said. Not completely. We can't erase the past, and I wouldn't want to. But we start building a new relationship based on who we actually are, not who we thought we were supposed to be. What does that look like? It looks like honesty. It looks like you stopping yourself when you start to feel guilty about the past and focusing on being present now. It looks like me stopping myself when I start to feel resentful and remembering that you did the best you could with what you knew. Robert reached across the table and took my hand. His fingers were calloused from years of construction work, familiar and strange at the same time. I want to try, he said. I want to learn how to be your father, not your biological father, but your father nonetheless. I'd like that too. Over the following weeks, Robert and I began the slow process of rebuilding our relationship. It wasn't easy. Decades of patterns don't change overnight. But there was something different now, something honest and intentional that had never existed before. He started asking about my work, really listening when I told him about my clients and the challenges of being a therapist. He began sharing stories about his own life, about the pressures he'd felt as a young husband and father, about the fears that had driven his distance. I was terrified I'd love you and then find out you weren't mine, he admitted during one of our weekly coffee meetings. So I tried to protect myself by not loving you completely. But you can't love someone halfway, Kate. It doesn't work. No, I agreed. It doesn't. My relationship with my mother also evolved during this time. The secrets that had defined our family dynamic for so long were finally out in the open, and while it was initially painful, it was also liberating. Linda no longer had to carefully manage conversations between Robert and me, no longer had to carry the weight of her secret alone. I feel like I can breathe for the first time in 30 years, she told me during one of our increasingly frequent phone calls. Not because I'm glad the secret is out, but because I don't have to pretend anymore. I don't have to watch every word, worry about every conversation. She also began developing her own relationship with Michael. It started with a phone call. She wanted to thank him for being so welcoming to me, to apologize for keeping me from him for so long. Their conversation led to others, and while they would never be friends in the traditional sense, they found a way to be cordial co-parents to an adult daughter they both loved. It's strange, Michael told me during one of our weekly calls. I spent 20 years wondering about the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, and your mother spent 28 years feeling guilty about our affair. But talking to her now, I realized we were both just young people making the best decisions we could with limited information. Do you regret it? I asked. The affair, I mean. I regret the pain it caused your family. I regret that it created so much uncertainty and hurt. But I can't regret the relationship that created you. You're the best thing that ever came out of that complicated time in all our lives. As my first Christmas with the truth approached, I found myself in the unique position of having two fathers who both wanted to be part of my life. Robert had been hesitant to include Michael in family gatherings, but I'd insisted. This is our new normal, I told him. Michael is part of my life now, which means he's part of our family. We can either make this work, or we can make this awkward, but either way, he's going to be around. Christmas dinner was surreal. Robert and Linda sat at one end of a table, Michael at the other, with me in the middle, literally and figuratively. Sarah was there too, serving as emotional support and occasional conversation starter when things got too tense. But as the evening wore on, something unexpected happened. Robert and Michael began talking, tentatively at first, then with increasing ease. They discovered they both loved baseball, Both worried about the state of education, both had strong opinions about Chicago politics. "You know," Michael said to Robert as we were clearing dishes, "I want to thank you." "For what?" "For raising her. For being there when I couldn't be. She's an incredible woman, and that's because of the foundation you and Linda gave her." Robert's eyes filled with tears again. "She is incredible, and I'm realizing that has nothing to do with whose DNA she carries and everything to do with who she chose to become." Later that evening, after Michael had gone back to his hotel and my parents had driven home, I sat in my apartment reflecting on how much had changed in less than a year. I'd gone from being a woman who felt fundamentally flawed, who couldn't understand why her father seemed to love her conditionally, to being someone who understood her place in the world. The truth had been devastating and liberating in equal measure. Learning that Robert wasn't my biological father had initially felt like losing a parent, but it had ultimately freed both of us to choose our relationship rather than simply accepting the one we'd inherited. And finding Michael had given me something I'd never known I was missing. A parent who looked at me with uncomplicated joy, who was proud of me without reservation, who wanted to know everything about my life simply because I was his daughter. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned that family isn't just about genetics. Robert Henderson had raised me, had been there for the scraped knees and bad dreams and teenage heartbreaks, even when he'd struggled to show his love fully. That counted for something. That counted for everything. 3 days after Christmas, I received a text from Robert that made me cry. "Watching you with Michael yesterday, seeing how happy you are, I realized something. I spent 28 years afraid I wasn't your real father. Turns out, being a real father has nothing to do with DNA and everything to do with choosing to love someone completely. I'm ready to make that choice now if you'll let me." I called him immediately. "Dad," I said when he answered, and the word felt different now, chosen rather than assumed, meaningful rather than obligatory. "I've been waiting my whole life for you to make that choice. Better late than never. Much better late than never." 6 months later, I walked down the aisle at my wedding with 2 fathers, Robert on one side, Michael on the other. It was unconventional, but then again, so was our family. Sarah, my maid of honor, had joked that I was probably the only bride in history who'd gained a father instead of losing one to marriage. But as I looked out at the small gathering of family and friends, at my mother dabbing her eyes with a tissue, at my fiancé David waiting for me at the altar with a smile that made my heart race, I realized that this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of pain or complication, but the presence of truth and choice and love in all its messy, imperfect forms. The DNA test that had shattered my understanding of my family had ultimately saved it. By facing the truth we'd all been afraid of for so long, we'd found a way to love each other authentically for the first time. And as I said my vows to David, promising to love him completely and without reservation, I thought about the lesson my family had taught me, that the strongest bonds aren't the ones we're born with, but the ones we choose to forge and maintain and nurture day after day, year after year. The truth had set us free. But more than that, it had taught us how to love without conditions, how to be family by choice rather than by accident, how to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of what came before. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all. 1 year later, I'm sitting in my new office at the counseling center, looking at a family photo on my desk. It's from last month's barbecue at my house, Robert and Linda on one side, Michael on the other, David and me in the middle, all of us laughing at something Sarah had said behind the camera. It's not a traditional family photo, but then again, we're not a traditional family. A knock on my door interrupts my thoughts. "Come in." It's Dr. Martinez, my supervisor, carrying a file. "I have a new client for you." Interesting case, 25-year-old woman who just found out through genetic testing that the man who raised her isn't her biological father. She's struggling with questions about identity and family dynamics. I take the file, scanning the intake notes. The young woman's story is different from mine in the details, but similar in the fundamental questions. Who am I? What makes a family? How do you rebuild relationships after the foundation shifts beneath your feet? "I'll take her," I say, already thinking about the first session, about how I'll help her navigate the complex emotions that come with this kind of revelation. Because if there's one thing I've learned in the past year, it's that the truth, even when it's painful, even when it changes everything, is always worth pursuing. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to face it, It can transform your life in ways you never imagined possible. The truth doesn't always set you free immediately. Sometimes it breaks you first. But from those broken pieces, you can build something stronger, something chosen, something real. And that, I've discovered, makes all the difference. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.